Good. All right. We've got our next speaker ready to go. And we've got our slides. All right. Thanks, everyone. So next up, we've got Michelle Vazzana here to talk with us about some great research that she's been doing around sales management. Michelle is a founding partner at Vantage Point Performance. She's also a co-author of the book Cracking the Sales Management Code, which if you have not read, I highly recommend. It's a great book with some new insights on how to really manage sales performance. She also is a sought-after speaker when it comes to sales management and leadership, and has over 30 years of experience in management and sales. So she's been doing this since she was born, I'm pretty sure. So she's here today to specifically challenge our conventional wisdom when it comes to sales management and share her research around specifically which sales practices are most highly correlated with driving sales performance. So welcome, Michelle.
How are we doing? I'm standing in between you and lunch, which is not a great place to be, but we'll make the best of it. How's that? Does that work? All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a different session than probably a lot of the other sessions you've been in, because we're going to talk about things that might seem a little more squishy or a little softer. And what we've done is we've worked to quantify some of those things. And let me just jump ahead here. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is what are the small things that sales managers can do to actually help you as sales operations professionals get better bang for the buck that you invest in tools, processes, and that sort of thing. But it begs the question, why are we not getting the results that we want now? Why are a lot of the things that we've invested in not yielding the pay dirt that either we've been promised or that we expect? And the fundamental issue at play here is we have an execution challenge. We have a problem. And we're going to examine what that is, and then what some of the conventional beliefs that we've brought into this space, how they get in our way, and then what we can do a little bit differently. So sales leaders, the reality of being a sales leader is you've always got this huge target over your head, right? You got a number to hit. And for public companies, it's worse, right? So what does the sales leader get if the number's met? What happens the next year? Goes up, right? So what we know is that targets are getting more and more aggressive. 92% of the companies from 2015 to 2016 raised their revenue targets. And this is a reality for you as a sales operations professional, because your sales leadership is going to look to you to figure out, help me make this number. What can we do to get better productivity out of our sales force? So as a sales operations rock star, you're going to do some very specific things, right? You're going to do some heavy analytics. You're going to identify the KPIs that you think will get your sellers to quota. You're going to put tools in place, CRM systems, CPQ software, all kinds of other things in order to facilitate better productivity. You're going to formalize your sales processes. You're even going to ensure that your people get trained. And these are just a few of the many significant investments that you make in your sales force to make sure that you help that sales leader hit that number, because that's the only game in town. Now, there's an assumption at play here which turns out to be a pretty dangerous assumption. And that assumption is that your sales managers, in order to get more sellers at quota, will be able to meaningfully incorporate these tools and use them most effectively to get more sellers at quota. That's why you make these investments. You take your best salespeople, you promote them to sales management, you put the right tools in place, and you expect they're going to use them effectively. And you're shaking your head down there because you're not seeing that happen. So the reality of the situation is that as our tools have become more sophisticated, right, as our systems have become more sophisticated, as we provide better and better data to our sales leaders and sales managers, at that same time, the percentage of salespeople at quota has been in a steady decline. Over the last 6 years, the percentage of sellers at quota has gone down. And it's consistently gone down. So we've got this imbalance between the investments we're making and the results that we're achieving as a result of these investments. And what I often hear is, well, that may have to do with the fact that a lot of the sales managers are relatively inexperienced. You take a sales rep, you make them sales manager, There's not a lot of good training out there for sales managers. They're going to figure it out. Well, when we looked into the data, because we have over 600 managers in this study, and we looked in the data and we took a look at the difference in percentage of sellers at quota between those sales managers with over 11 years sales management experience versus those sales managers with less than 4 years experience, there was only a 9% difference in the percentage of sellers at quota. So in concrete terms, they're getting about one more seller to quota. The most tenured sales managers are getting about one more seller on their team to quota than basically brand new sales managers. So there's this big disconnect between what you're doing to equip the sales force and the real productivity you're getting out of the sales force. And the question becomes, why is this? What happens in the dynamics that are at play in your front line that are creating these marginalized investments? Well, in order to better understand why this occurs, it's useful to get a little perspective. So let's just start with your perspective as a sales ops professional. You're doing all these great things, and you're doing all these great things because you believe in your heart of hearts that you're going to have an outsized impact on sales effectiveness. Of all the things that are put in place in the organizations to equip the sales force, you probably firmly believe that yours are they're the most significant, as well you should, right? The issue with this is that from the sales manager's seat, things look very different. So let's take a look at it from the sales manager's seat. So you've got a very motivated person who's now managing a team or has been managing a team for a while. And their reality is they've got a lot of pressures being exerted on them, many of which they have no control over. So for example, they got their sales leader riding herd on them to hit the number, deliver the forecast. They've got human resources weighing in on them, wanting them to develop their people, assess against these competency models. They've got their sales team. Their sales team needs help with pricing. They need help with proposals. They need help going on sales calls. And not to mention customers, right? Customers have demands. Now, when you fit sales operations into the reality of the sales manager, what happens is, from their perspective, you might just be part of the noise. And what we're finding is the more sophisticated the systems are that support sales management, the more tools are available to sales managers, the more complicated their job becomes. And the reasons they took the job are not really the reality of being in the job. And when you add up all of these pressures, what happens is, you have somebody like this. And, if you followed sales managers around, they don't tend to be, the calmest bunch. Their hair's on fire most of the time. And a lot of what they experience on a day-to-day basis is a reactive scenario. And because all these pressures are exerted on them, they get into this mindset that they don't really have control over their job, that it really isn't the job they thought they were taking. They're not getting to do the things they wanted to do when they took the job, so they're really just trying to keep their head above water. What do we do about that? What do you as a sales operations professional do about that? How do you take this chaos that is the life of the sales manager, help this person leverage these tools in a way that really will make a difference? And the good news is, not all sales managers are falling into this trap. Some of them are actually figuring out some pretty good things. And we're going to talk about what those things are. And we're probably going to blow some myths that you've probably carried with you for many years. So in our study, the top 20, well, first of all, let's step back for a moment and do a little level set. We could probably all agree that in order to have better sales managers, we're promoting some of our best salespeople. Is that true? Yes? Because we're not going to take our average performers and put them in a leadership role. So we're taking our best people, we're promoting them into sales management, so off to a good start. The challenge is that you've taken a really successful salesperson, you've put them in a sales management role, and in our study, 75% of those managers are failing. The top 25% exceeded their revenue targets by 15%. Pretty good, right? The bottom 25% fell short by 24%. That's a huge gap between your top 25 and your bottom 25. Now, what's interesting is when we peel back the onion a little bit and look a little further in the data, what we find is that there are some trends regarding sales manager performance that were a bit unexpected. So when we did this study, we took a look at 2 success measures. One of them was the manager's achievement of their revenue target, which is a very common metric managers are measured against, right? The other metric that we used, or measure that we used in our study to identify success, was percentage of your sellers that were at or above quota for the last calendar year. It's a different measure. It's more of a participation metric. So when we took a look at the top 25% of managers, they, of course, exceeded their targets. The bottom 25 were pretty low. The middle 50%, the average revenue achievement was right around a little under quota, 99%. Not so bad, right? They're almost at quota. But when you think about the increasing revenue targets that you face, that's the reality of your world, when we took a look at that second performance measure and we looked at percentage of sellers at or above quota, the bottom 25% had, on average, 47% of their reps at or above quota. The middle 50% had, on average, 49% of the reps at or above quota. So the difference in percentage of reps at or above quota between the middle 50 and the bottom 25 was almost the same. So those middle group, that middle group of managers, are really over-relying on 1 or 2 reps to overachieve to hit that number. Well, that's really not a sustainable approach, right? The goal is to have more balanced performance across your team, not rely on a few superstars. And then what we need to do in order to accomplish that is identify what are the things that those high performers are doing that are in the same environment, face the same chaos, that allows them to achieve at a much higher level. Well, when we take a look at the top 25% of managers, they actually got 30% of their more of their reps at quota. And this next statistic is a little bit shocking. Per manager, they generated on average $3.5 million more in revenue. This is actually a pretty conservative estimate. One of our recent clients estimated this number closer to about 10 million. So in our study, what we found is that the practices that these high performers are engaging in, they're not obvious. I had about 40 hypotheses going into this study and designed the instrument in order to be able to answer some pretty thorny questions. And some of the things we found were a little bit surprising, but it forced us to look a little deeper. So let's talk about what some of our conventional wisdom is, what the research shows, and what that means for you. So let's start here. High-performing managers spend more time in the field. What do you think? Yes? Do we agree? How many people agree? Oh, there's only like 2. Like, I'm not going to answer that because I'm going to be wrong because you're setting me up. So this is conventional wisdom for almost every single sales leader I've ever spoken to. As a matter of fact, some sales leaders go so far as to make requirements that sales managers spend upwards of 75 to 80% of their time in the field. Right? Because we firmly believe that the more time you spend in the field, the more sales calls you go on with your reps, the more you're going to sell. Now, that's probably true if you are a sales rep, not as a sales manager, right? So what did the research show? Well, the bottom 75% attend more sales calls than the top 25%. Significantly more. And the bottom 25% reported that they spend significantly more time in the field than their organization requires. So they overcorrect with field time. Whereas when we take a look at the higher performing managers, they attend fewer sales calls and they spend about the amount of time the organization requires or slightly less. That's a little surprising, isn't it? Right? Because if you go with the old idea that more field time leads to better performance, that's not necessarily true. And what we're doing here is we're identifying some initial insight into the thought process and the decision making that is exemplified by high performers versus average and low performers. They're a lot more judicious about how they spend their time. They're much better able to prioritize. So they do spend time in the field, but the time they spend is different. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, let's go to another common belief that we have. High-performing sales managers spend more time coaching each seller. Yes? Oh, come on, there's lots of studies out there. Coaching matters. Coaching leads to better performance, right? Well, it depends. So, what are the critical mass doing? What are those 75% of managers that have less than half of their teams at quota doing? Well, they reported coaching each seller between 10 and 20 hours per month. Now, here's what's fascinating about that. If you have an average team size, which we did in our study of 9.1 managers, the math doesn't even work. So what we're finding is that the lower performers, we believe, are pretty dramatically overestimating the amount of time they actually spend coaching. They also overestimate, to some degree, the amount of time they spend in the field. The higher performers are much more accurate at portraying the practices they actually employ. So first thing is, they say they spend a lot of time coaching. They also coach more frequently. They have more frequent conversations with each of their sellers. Now, on the surface, these sound like good things. I do a lot of coaching, and I do it frequently. How can that be a bad thing? Well, we're going to examine that in a little bit more detail. This last point is a really interesting one and has downstream implications. So low performers coach more hours, supposedly, coach more frequently, and have shorter conversations. Not necessarily inherently bad, but it's different than what the high performers are doing. So the last point here is that the lower performing managers primarily spend time with their reps planning when the rep seeks them out. Right, we talked about this reactive nature of sales management. So the lower performers are waiting for people to seek them out to actually spend time helping them. So what are the high-performing few doing differently? Well, first of all, they report coaching around 5 hours a month per rep. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Sales Executive Council? Probably most of you, right? They did this study about 12 years ago that said the sweet spot is between 3 and 5 hours per month. The problem is they didn't tell you exactly what kind of coaching should happen for those 3 to 5 hours, right? So we buy into the number, but there's a lot of different types of coaching, and they have different outcomes based on your role. So the high-performing few are coaching around 5 hours per month per rep, which seems realistic. The math works. So what else are they doing? Well, they're coaching less frequently. When we ask them, how often do you have certain types of conversations, because we did examine very different types of coaching, not just one type. In the 30 minutes, we can't give you all the details, but suffice it to say, they're coaching less frequently. And they're spending more time. So when you ask the question, can you identify best practices for me? Because I just want to put some processes in place for my managers that incorporate those best practices so we can dramatically improve the effectiveness of our sales managers. And the answer really is, it's not a one-size-fits-all affair. You have different sales roles, you have different go-to-market models. It's a lot more complicated than just coach for 5 hours, have 1 hour discussions of this type with this frequency. So you really have to consider the nature of the sales management role and the nature of the sales roles they're managing. But in general, when we think about practices that matter, less frequent conversations, but deeper conversations tend to be more effective. Less frequent time in the field, but more effective time in the field matters. And again, we'll give you a little bit more detail on this in just a couple of minutes. So the last thing that I want to share on this particular point is that the highest performing sales managers are the ones that actually request the planning discussions. They're more formal about it. They don't wait for the seller to seek them out. They're in tune with their sellers' pipelines. They identify high potential opportunities, and they request planning discussions around those. So in general, more proactive. One last belief I'm going to share with you. This is a real hot topic right now. More successful managers are more likely to formally schedule their coaching conversations. What do you think about that? That's a little bit of a thorny one, isn't it? Right? It makes sense, right? That was my first hypothesis out of 40. Of course this matters. Of course this is correlated to success. It was a real bummer when I analyzed the data. And what I found was that almost all of the sales managers in our study are likely to schedule opportunity coaching discussions and have call planning discussions on an ad hoc basis. Now, 10 years ago, I don't believe this would have been true. But there's a lot of buzz about management rhythms, operating rhythms, putting in place management process. I mean, it's a really big deal. And we are of the same mind that you have to have some formality. However, just scheduling these conversations didn't make enough of a difference, right? It's about what you do in those conversations. Are you doing them in the right frequency? Are you talking about the right things in those conversations? So while scheduling conversations is probably quite useful because it makes sure they happen, what you do during those conversations matters more than you might suspect. So what are the high-performing few doing differently? Well, they're having more in-depth discussions less frequently. Right? If you have a team of 10 people, you can't meet with every person every week for 1 to 2 hours. The math doesn't work. So you can either have significantly more short conversations or fewer in-depth conversations. Lower performing managers overcorrect by having more frequent but superficial conversations. High performing managers resist that trap. They do put some structure in place, but it's what we would call the minimum level of rigor. They put just enough structure to allow them to drive the outcomes they want while allowing flexibility in their schedule. This is where organizations often get this wrong, because they believe if a little structure is good, a lot of structure is better. It doesn't work when it comes to improving sales management. So they have more in-depth discussions and they have them less frequently. Another thing they do that matters is they focus on the early stages of the sales cycle when they do their coaching around opportunities. Lower performing managers focus on the latter stages of the sales cycle because that's more urgent. They also, when they're having these discussions, not only strategize opportunities, fewer of them in more depth, but they also move into planning conversations for key upcoming sales calls. So when you think about what makes the difference between the high-performing few and the low to average performing masses, the frequency of conversations matters. And intuitively, you would think that more conversations would be better. It's not true. So frequency matters. Different kinds of coaching require different types of frequencies. The duration of these conversations matters. If you don't allow enough time, they're too superficial. The topics matter, right? High-performing managers tend to talk about early-stage deals to get them properly qualified. Get good deals in, keep bad deals out. Lower-performing managers orient most of their conversations around their pipeline to scrubbing the data to deliver the forecast. Those are very different conversations. They might take the same amount of time, but the focus of those conversations are different. And again, they really orient toward those early stages. So when we think about what this means for you as a sales operations professional, I'm going to give you a quick case study. And I only have a few minutes left, but I think this will be somewhat illuminating. So we did this work with GE, which was really fascinating because, big company, lots of resources, very deep pockets, very sophisticated analytics. They got all the right stuff. And they're a mature company, right? So they should have a lot of this figured out. But when we started working with this particular division, they had very unhealthy pipelines, poor close rates, and they had done a survey for their sales reps, and the sales reps said, we're getting almost no coaching. Now that, in and of itself, may not be shocking to you, but considering the fact that for 5 years, they had been focusing on equipping those managers to coach, it was a problem. They gave them 5 separate courses over 4 years, and they took those managers out of the field for about 5,000 hours in order to make sure that they knew how to coach, and they weren't coaching. And they had very formal management rhythms in place, right? Each manager was with each seller 1 hour per week, so 4 hours per month, coaching them on that pipeline. So on the surface, it looked like they were doing most of the right things. But when we peeked under the hood a little bit more, we found that there was this one high performer, and we're going to call him Diego because his name is Diego. And Diego was doing some things differently, but let's talk a little bit about this man because it's useful to know the background. He was one of the newest sales managers. He had only been in the job for a year. He was geographically isolated from the other sales managers. His market was very underdeveloped. He had the same size team as everybody else. And we had done a series of structured interviews with this management team prior to finding out about their performance. We didn't know Diego's performance. We didn't know any of the managers' performance. We just wanted to see what we could learn without having bias. So when we interviewed Diego, he wasn't particularly impressive. He couldn't really tell us what he was doing. He had a hard time articulating his process. And then we took a look at the numbers. And the average pipeline size for the sales management team at large was 41 million. The average pipeline size for Diego's team was 29 million. That's a little shocking. That's the kind of thing that would make a sales leader stay up at night, right? 29 million? Oh my God, you need a bigger pipeline. But when we looked a little further, this is where it became interesting. So the average sales per rep across the management team was about 4.7 million. But not for Diego's reps. On average, 7 million. And it gets even more interesting. Their win rates of Diego's team were in some cases more than double. And again, this is from a gentleman who's relatively new to management and really couldn't articulate what he was doing that made a difference. So we had to actually go follow him around. And when we followed him around, we found some interesting things, which tie right back to the research that you just heard. Now, another interesting thing about Diego's team is they were much more highly productive around their activities, not just their results. Win rates take a while. You got to pursue deals and win them, right? And you got to do that in order to get more revenue. But his team had significantly more meetings per quarter than the other teams. Now, Diego was doing all of the things that we just talked to you about in our research. He was having the right kind of formally scheduled discussions. He was orienting most of his conversations to the early stages. Based on the deals that they were pursuing, he was requesting these planning conversations. And what Diego did that was really interesting is he was maniacal about what it took to get a deal in the pipeline. Because once it was in the pipeline, what happens? Right? All eyes are on it. So sellers are kind of hesitant to put things in the pipeline unless you're one of the other management teams, which they encouraged a lot of deals in the pipeline, hence their bigger pipelines. So he was maniacal about what it took to get a deal in the pipeline and made sure that it was effectively qualified. So when we took these practices that at that time were just best practices based on our anecdotal evidence, and we now know are true based on our research, what happened to this management team? So when we started working with them, their close rates of forecasted revenue, not just pipeline revenue, but forecasted, these are the deals they thought they were going to win, was 25%. 9 months later, they had risen to 37%. That's a pretty good lift, right? No one's going to argue with that. But here's what's interesting. Those managers that are the most successful, they don't have one way of doing something. They're agile. And they have processes in place that drive that agility. And let me give you an example of how that played out at GE. So once they started paying the right kind of attention to their sellers and their sellers' pipelines, they started noticing things. And at about this 9-month point, what they noticed is that they had a significantly higher success rate on smaller deals than on the larger deals, which were typically their target. So they were targeting larger companies, and they were not winning many of those. They were winning much small to mid-sized companies. So what they did, because they were paying the right kind of attention, is they adjusted their targeting strategy. They adjusted it to small to mid-sized businesses, and that was a really big deal. You know, had they not been paying that close of attention, they wouldn't have had that information. So they adjusted their targeting strategy, and you can see what happened to their close rates. Significant. And this means that your managers are paying the right kind of attention to the right types of things based on the nature of the roles they manage. It's not about, do I meet weekly, bi-weekly, or quarterly? It's about, am I having the right kinds of conversations about the right things based on the roles of the people I'm managing? Am I getting to the right level of depth? And am I really driving improved capability in my sellers? So it's not just about coaching. It's about coaching the right stuff in the right way, at the right depth to drive the right outcomes. And these are the kinds of results that we see. This is not an anomaly. Happens all the time. And it's about making small changes, but the right changes that drive the right impact. So what does this mean for you as a sales operations professional, right? We've talked a lot about some kind of squishy things around coaching. We've got some quantifiable information behind it, but what does this mean for you? So as you are working to provide tools, to provide processes, to provide systems. It's vital for you to make sure that the tools support the right type of coaching. If you want your managers orienting toward early stages, are you providing enough detail in order to help them identify which deals they should be coaching? Do they understand by rep if there's stalled deals in the early stages to the mid stages to the late stages? Are you using that information really to drive the right kind of insight? Rhythms. The biggest mistake I see around rhythms is that organizations over-engineer them. We've had sales leader after sales leader who puts rhythms in place that are so rigorous that they only work under optimal conditions. That's the exact opposite of what drives effective management. Our experience and our research would suggest the minimum level of rigor around those rhythms are going to yield the best outcomes. If you can accomplish it by meeting once a month, don't meet once a week, right? If doing account planning once every quarter is effective or is sufficient, don't do it once a month. More is not always better. So more is not better regarding field time. More is not better with regarding coaching hours. It's about being very selective about the direction you give your managers and the way that you use those tools in order to support those efforts. So I think I'm at the end of my time. I'll be around. I'm sorry about that. I'll be around for the rest of the day, along with my colleague back here, Michael Lautner. Say hi, Michael. So thank you for coming to our session, and we hope we get to chat with you at some point. Thank you.